Getting ready to buy or sell a home? Do you want to help support pro-life organizations? Then you need Real Estate for Life. Get a top-notch real estate agent and support pro-life causes. Go to realestateforlife.org to learn more.
Another fantastic saint for today, St. Charles Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan, Italy, reformer, leading figure at the Council of Trent, patron saint of seminaries, an absolutely tremendous figure in the church, and came at a critical time in history, right as the Protestant Revolution was beginning to grow, and from which the church has still yet to recover, but put in a much better position due to the efforts of this one man, Charles Borromeo. He was of a very rich and noble family. In fact, the de Medici family, pious young child, and vowed himself to God at the age of 12. And he was a brilliant student, even though he had to overcome a speech impediment as a young man. His father died when he was 16, and although he was the third of 6 children, he was placed as head of the household. And so while he was still going to school, he also managed his family finances and he did a reasonably well job, but not as good of a job as he could have done because he put prayer as more important. He would do his prayers, he would do his studies, and then with the time he had left, he would do the family finances. So quite a capable young man who also had his priorities in order. And doing the finances for a wealthy, noble family, that's not a small thing. And especially because how much money you had, also, it was a status symbol as well. So the family's reputation was on the line, hanging on the shoulders of a 16-year-old young boy who was still going to school. So he accomplished it all. And let's see, the Catholic Church and the world became a better place when Pius IV was elected Pope in 1559. Not because he was such a great Pope, but because he put his nephew, Charles Borromeo, as Cardinal Deacon of Rome. Now this occurred by now, St. Charles Borromeo was 21 years old. He had a degree in canon law and civil law. I think he had his doctorate already. But he was placed in charge of this high position in the church. He was put in charge of governing the papal states and supervising the Knights of Malta, the Franciscan, and the Carmelite orders. And while it was customary, nepotism was just in full swing, and this is really just what it was. It wasn't that St. Charles Borromeo was seen as this incredible figure. He was seen as a reasonably competent young man, but he was a nephew of the Pope, and so of course the Pope was going to put his nephews and so on, and uncles and brothers, whatever, into positions of power. So that's what happened, and nobody expected Charles actually to take it as seriously as he did. Most young men in that position used their wealth and influence to enrich themselves, and St. Charles did the opposite. He promoted the interests of the church first and put himself and everybody around him last. And in fact, he only took what was strictly necessary for the basics of life, and the rest he used for the service of the poor. And as I mentioned, Charles Borromeo was part of the Medici family, and it was one of the princes of the Medici family that Machiavelli wrote his book, The Prince, about, which is all about how to get and keep and maintain power. And so there was a lot of corruption at this time, especially to people that Charles Borromeo was related to. And so it was kind of that much more amazing that he had such abilities at such a young age, and despite the fact that many of his relatives were such bad examples, he overcame all of that and was a model of piety and ability. Now, one of the great pressing matters to Cardinal Deacon Borromeo was clerical reform. As I mentioned, the Protestant Revolution was erupting all over Europe at this time. And this was not due really to any great merit on the part of Protestantism. No heresy really has anything of great value to it. It's because the Catholic Church is so bad, there's so much corruption in the church. Heresy is a reaction to bad example. That's the scandal our Lord warned about in the Gospels and prophesied about. So it was due to tremendous corruption in the clerical among the clerical state, priests, bishops, and so on, not knowing their faith, not knowing the catechism, not knowing the truth, not living up to the truth that they do know. That's what needed to be reformed. So now the Council of Trent had been called 17 years earlier for this very purpose. It was called in 1545 by Pope Paul III. It was never finished, though. It convened for 2 years. It was postponed for 4 years. It was convened for another year under a different pope and postponed for 10 years, and then more. It was just dragging on and dragging on, and it was still needed to be finished. And so St. Charles Borromeo convinced his uncle, Pius IV, we need to do this council. We need to finish Trent and make this happen. Pius IV recognized the need. He said, "You're right. This is true, and you need to be the one to do it. So I want you to organize Trent." That final session. St. Charles Borromeo began organizing Trent, and he was 21 years old when he was appointed a cardinal deacon, and he was 21 years old when he started making all the arrangements to call together a council. Now, you can imagine the preparations that would go into calling a council these days. With all the modern benefits of email, phone, internet, etc. Charles, he didn't have any of that. He had nothing, none of that. He wrote letters by hand, and he corresponded, and he did all that slow snail mail stuff in the 1500s, and he convened it in just a couple years. By 1563, Trent would be convened, and it was due to the absolutely prodigious efforts of St. Charles Borromeo. He wasn't even 25 years old, and here he was calling the Catholic world together to discuss the highest levels of doctrine and reform. Absolutely amazing. He was precocious in this wisdom and ability. He possessed that incredible intellect, a high energy, determination, courage, piety, devotion, charity, self-discipline. I mean, any single one of these qualities would have been amazing, and he possessed them all. And so he did bring, he got Trent convened, and it successfully concluded, out of which we got that excellent Catechism of the Council of Trent. That wasn't written by Charles Borromeo, but he certainly enabled and helped it to happen. So after this, after the success of Trent, Cardinal Borromeo decided that God was calling him to the priesthood, right? He's still a deacon at this point. So this is a little theologically backwards, right? Organize a council of the church, be involved in the highest level, and you're not even a priest yet. In fact, he wasn't able to be a priest yet because he wasn't old enough to be ordained. You have to be 26, and he was still younger than that after all these things. So finally, he was ordained a priest in September of 1564 at 26 years old. 3 months after his priestly ordination, he was ordained a bishop, and 5 months later, he was made Archbishop of Milan, which was the largest diocese in the entire Catholic world, and it was also the most corrupt. And he was placed in charge of it. So basically, he was like, you are the guy. You have to take the biggest diocese in the church, the most corrupt, and fix it. After you've just done these incredible efforts at Trent, now you've proven yourself capable in this lesser matter. Now take on a harder one. And so he did. And he began by continuing, essentially, and implementing all the reforms that that had been mentioned at Trent. He established a seminary program whereby young men would be educated properly on the actual doctrines of the church to combat the Protestant heresy, which was everywhere being distributed by the Protestants. And of course, he was able to use what would become the Catechism of Trent, and so on. So he wanted to give these young men spiritual, intellectual, and moral education. Very forward thinking in that seeing that the Reformation, the Protestant Revolution, came about because of weak priests, because of a weak clergy. So if you want to prevent this from happening in the future, have a strong clergy and have strong priests. And so he puts into place a seminary program. And in fact, this is why he's known as the patron saint of seminaries. Out at our seminary in Denton, today is a first-class feast, and in seminaries everywhere, this is one of the patron saints of their organization. But he's this shows his intellect. He's thinking in both directions. So he's like, you want to have good priests, you need good seminaries. But if you want good candidates coming to seminaries, you need good young boys. And so he began to lay the foundation for what would become a Sunday school program. Is start with those 6 and 7 and 8-year-old boys. You teach them well. By the time they're 17 and 18, now they're ready to go to the seminary. And just from the whole time forward, he had a good plan and a good program in mind. He also drew up a rule of life for his clergy, gave them, tasks to accomplish throughout the day, tasks of prayer, a rule of prayer. He abolished the sale of indulgences and other financial excesses, insisted upon strict clerical continence, and again, most of all, insisting upon the recitation of the breviary and personal prayer. And St. Charles knew that if you want to demand a level of performance from somebody, you have to display the performance. And so he himself, that cardinal deacon or cardinal priest now, Archbishop of Milan, he set the example in his own personal prayer life. So he would spend hours a day in prayer. That you can't do anything worthwhile on the outside if you haven't first taken care of the inside. And this shows his excellent leadership abilities in that to give himself time for prayer, he delegated tasks. He would find those men most suited for the tasks that he needed to get done, and he would put them in charge of making it happen. And he wouldn't choose the holiest person or the most pious person. He chose the one with the most skill for the task at hand. If he needed somebody to manage finances, he got somebody good at finances. If he needed an excellent leader, he would find somebody who had been in the military or so on. Right? These things that he would look for. And that's the hallmark of a leader in a high position. He's responsible for so much, but one of the most important skills he needs is the skill to recognize skill in other people. Is that you would be good at this task, you would be good at this task. And in fact, that is what leadership is. Leadership is recognizing the potential in others and helping them to achieve it, maximizing the potentiality of others' greatness. That is what St. Charles Borromeo was able to do to an excellent degree. And so he was able to put the right people in the job, to know that they were doing a good job. It was handled excellently, and then he himself had time for prayer. So he considered for a while. He took a retreat, as part of his regular prayer routine. He took a retreat and began to consider whether or not he should retire to a monastery and just leave the worry and care and business of the archdiocese behind. And so you can imagine the weight he was carrying and the difficulty. But while he was contemplating this, he was admonished by his spiritual director, stay where you are. The church cannot afford to lose you right now. It's not easy administering, especially when everything's corrupt and everything's falling apart, but it was tremendously important to the church. And so he needed that admonition and encouragement, stay where you are. Now, to give us an idea of the kind of the scope of his abilities and the scope of his care, there was, in 1576, a famine struck the area, followed by a plague, and it was so bad that the civil governors fled. The civil authorities left, and St. Charles Borromeo, the Catholic bishop, was left trying to care for the city both spiritually and temporally. He had both the religious and the civic affairs fell onto him. And so he arranged, through his family contacts, the wealthy Medici family, he arranged to feed up to 70,000 people per day, and he used his own personal fortune to pay for it. And after all of his own resources were spent, he went into deep debt, but he saved the lives of tens of thousands of people. And you read about it at a similar time. There was a plague of Rome. It may have been the same plague. I'm not sure if I've got the centuries right. But in the plague in Rome, the population went from like 300,000 to 50,000 because of the plague, because of wars and so on. Just huge numbers of people either left or starved to death or died of the plague. And St. Charles Borromeo prevented thousands of people from dying by spending his own personal money and his own abilities. He would travel to other dioceses as well. So not just is he fixing his own diocese, he's going to other dioceses, helping them with reforms and correction of abuses and so on. But all of this work began to take its toll. And he would become seriously ill while traveling. He returned to Milan, but he would not be able to recover. And he died on this day, the 3rd of November, in 1584 at 46 years of old, 46 years of age. There are clerics who don't even do 1/10 of what St. Charles Borromeo did in 80 years. And here he was living half that time, for the time he was 16 years old, taking care of other people, but first taking care of his own soul with prayer. So, one of those just absolutely astounding figures in the church, prodigious efforts, and God put him where he needed to be, right? St. Charles Borromeo was born in the right time and in the right place to do what he needed to do. And we can see the effect he had on the church. Absolutely incredible. We're still benefiting from those efforts of Charles Borromeo. And these days it seems, where are the saints? Where are those similar saints God is raising up? Two thoughts on that. Number one, the human will is free. People can choose whether to follow the call of God or not. And so, yes, God raised up St. Charles Borromeo, but St. Charles allowed himself to be raised up. He cooperated with God's plan. And so I would say, where are the saints today? Maybe they've refused God's graces. Right? Maybe that's why we're seeing what we are in the church, and that's a sad reality. That's why it's so important to pray for each other, to pray for the conversion of sinners, right? To pray for your priests, to pray for seminarians, and so on, that they can correspond to the graces they have. But also, secondly, we can't second guess God's plan. It may be that the world and the church needs to be in this circumstance for some reason or another. Maybe the saints are there, but God hasn't called them up yet. Maybe they're waiting to be called and just waiting for their time. We don't know. I would say what we can do is we do know very, very often, or I would say all of us should know, what's right in front of us. Are we parents? Do we have young children? Are we single? Are we older? Are we younger? Am I a student? Where am I? Wherever you are in your state in life, do what's in front of you. St. Charles Borromeo, when he was a young man, what did he do? He did his studies, he did his prayers, he took care of the family finances. He had his priorities. And that's what we should do. Look at our lives and ask ourselves, where are my priorities? And am I accomplishing things in order of their priorities? Most often, if we're unhappy, it's because we're not putting our priorities first. And so many people, I would tell you, the reason you don't spend time in prayer is because it's difficult and you don't like it. But if you were able to do that, your life would start to come in order. God would give you the wisdom to see that what is upsetting you isn't really that big of a deal. Just spend your time in prayer first. Everything else falls into line. So don't worry about the state of the world, the state of the church, the state of whatever. Let's worry about the state of our soul. And let's worry about, am I doing my prayers, my daily spiritual reading, my meditation, my 5 decades of the rosary, my morning prayers, my night prayers, right? My prayers throughout the day. Am I going this week? Did I budget time to go to the cemetery and pray for the dead? Let's do those things first. And then everything else will fall into place and we'll have nothing to worry about. Let's follow that example of St. Charles Borromeo. May God bless you all. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.